about black everything.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined here today with a longtime friend, colleague, E. Patrick Johnson, who is the Carlos Montezuma Professor of African American Studies and Performance Studies at Northwestern University, where he's also chair of the Department of African American Studies. He's the author of several books, the classic Appropriating Blackness, as well as Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, and his brand new book, Black Queer Southern Woman, Oral History, which is published by UNC Press. How you doing, E. Patrick?
I'm doing very well. Glad to be back here.
Good to have you here. So you're a North Carolina person.
I am born and raised in Western North Carolina and spent a lot of my formative years here in the Triangle at UNC as an undergraduate and an MA student, and then came back as
Carolina
a postdoc.
fellow.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, we had Robert Reed Farr on a couple of months ago. And when I think about yourself, Dwight McBride, obviously, Robert, as really for this generation of scholars, the OGs of Black queer studies. Can you talk about what it was like for you in those early days? Especially, Black studies. I mean, you're chairing a Black studies department now. 25 years ago, Black studies wasn't hospitable.
No.
To Black queer studies or even Black queer bodies for that matter.
No. Well, interestingly enough, when I was a undergraduate, there was no courses on sexuality studies, Black, white, in between, nothing. Right. It wasn't until, the explosion in the late 90s of queer theory and gender theory that anything close to Black queer studies could be possible. And I was in graduate school, transitioning to become an assistant professor. And one of the critiques early on of queer theory was that they weren't talking about race. And so for those of us who were looking at sexuality within our own community, Baldwin, for instance, no one had written about Baldwin's sexuality, we couldn't even use the theory that was available to us because race was not an analytic as part of that. So one of the things that, people like Dwight and Robert, we just started writing. But it was difficult because we were in a situation where the Academy wasn't quite ready for what we had to say. So we were kind of pioneers in that regard. I mean, of course, we had people like Samuel Delaney writing outside the Academy.
Right. Joseph Beam, of course. Right.
Yes, a lot of people like that. But in the Academy, and more importantly, being published in journals and books being published by university presses was still a little dicey. I think the turning point was in 2000 when I co-sponsored, along with Mae G. Henderson, the Black Queer Studies in the Millennium Conference.
Yes.
And out of that conference came Black Queer Studies, A Critical Introduction, which, that is sort of like a Bible now. And since then I, edited the Young G's. I'm the OG. I don't know the Young G's.
Right.
Because now they've taken up that mantle and really run with it and doing stuff that I couldn't have imagined.
When I think about that first edited volume, it reminds me of the impact that the late Winston Napier, his book on Black critical theory, we all had photocopying these articles, and he puts together this volume. I think there are a lot of folks felt that same way about the queer studies collection that you did with Mae.
Yeah, it was. It was an event, as it were. And of course, with any first, we got critiques, we got pushback about it being kind of U.S. focused, and we actually addressed that in the introduction. There weren't any trans people in the book because again, at that moment, we weren't talking about trans studies. In No Tea, No Shade, however, is a lot about trans. There's also a lot of non-U.S. based research going on. So, with each generation, you plow the field a little more and make it a little easier. But in those early days, it was a little touch and go.
The new book, Black Queer Southern Women, and of course this is a follow-up to Sweet Tea.
Yep.
I could imagine once Sweet Tea drops, there are obviously these critiques, right?
Yes.
What about Black queer women?
Yeah.
Did you feel any pressure to share the project with someone, right? Because I know the obvious critique is, well, why is this Black queer man doing this volume on Black queer women? How did you work through that yourself intellectually?
That's a really great question, because when I started, when I got the idea for Sweet Tea, it was going to include the stories of women. It was going to be, because there was no archive, of Black sexuality in the South in terms of an oral history.
Right.
It was very coast centric. You had a lot of stuff about the West Coast and New York. But there wasn't anything about the South. So the idea was actually to include women. But the running joke I tell about this is that once I started conducting the interviews, like everything, the gay men just took it over. They just took over the book. And in hindsight, I'm glad that the stories were not in the same volume, because the issues are very different. After Sweet Tea came out, I thought perhaps someone would do an oral history of Black queer women in the South. But years passed and it never happened. The other thing that was happening with me was when I would be at different places performing or speaking, inevitably there'd be someone in the audience say, well, when are you going to write the story on the women? And these were questions from women, saying, when are you going to tell our story?
So clearly you had earned the trust of many of these women that you could shepherd those stories into being.
Yeah, absolutely. But I still had a number of colleagues who's like, women ain't gonna talk to you, a Black gay man, they're not gonna talk to you. But that was not what I found to be true. Not only did they talk to me, they shared some very intimate, personal stories with me, and felt in some ways, I think, really comfortable with me, because I'm kind of disarming. I am also a Southerner.
Right.
And some women were chomping at the bit to tell anybody their story. And one of the through lines that really surprised me, and this speaks to my own gender and naivete around these issues, is the number of women who had some experience with sexual assault or sexual trauma. And that was hard. I interviewed 79 women, and 66 of those 79 revealed some form of sexual assault, sexual trauma, at the hands of male relatives. So I worked through some of those concerns in the introduction of the book, my own trepidation about being a man conducting these interviews, and I land on framing the project as an act of feminist historiography and feminist ethnography, taking up the principles of that, but also acknowledging my own privilege as a man. But I really see the book as a collaboration. The women were with me every step of the way. When I first started sharing excerpts from the book, many of them would be in the audience. When I did a stage reading of some of the stories in Chapel Hill in 2014, several of the women came and actually spoke. And so I always went forward with this project thinking of it as a collaborative process rather than me sort of poaching these stories.
One of the things I've appreciated about your work and your project more broadly is that you imagined it in multiple platforms.
Yes.
So I've seen many iterations over the last decade of Pouring Tea, and now that's actually now going into the film world. Talk a little bit about the film project.
Yes, I'm so excited. It wasn't my idea. That goes to John Jackson, my dear friend and colleague at Annenberg, who used to
dean of the Annenberg School.
Yeah, dean of the Annenberg School of Communication, and former faculty here at Duke. When John saw the premiere of Sweet Tea, the full-length stage play in Chicago in 2010, afterwards he said, "This should be a film." Yeah. And I said, "Sure." And several years passed, nothing happened. Then he came back around a few years later and he said, No, really, we should make a film. And originally his idea was to make a film about the making of the play. But of course, as with everything, once you start filming or writing or whatever the project is, it turns into the thing that it wants to be.
Right.
So the film is called Making Sweet Tea, and that metaphor runs throughout the film. It's about several things. It's about what has happened to some of these men since the first interview, some of which happened over 12, 13 years ago. It's also about the making of the play. Yeah. So you see behind the scenes footage. And it's also about my journey back home, home to the South, but also my home
right,
in Hickory,
right,
North Carolina.
Right.
And coming to terms with coming back home as an openly gay man. And the sort of, I wouldn't say blowback, but some of the issues that bubble up around that. And of course, we make a lot of tea throughout the film.
You mentioned John Jackson. I have this memory. It's the summer of 2002, and UNC, they still do. They have this organization called MURAP, which trains underrepresented undergraduates who are thinking about career in the professoriate. And they did a conference. The panelists were yourself, S. Craig Watkins,
Oh, yeah.
John Jackson, Ingrid Banks, myself, and I want to say the scholar who did the work on Sister Rosetta Thorpe.
Oh, yeah, Jerma Jackson.
Jerma Johnson, who's still at
UNC.
At UNC. That was 17 years ago.
Oh, my God. We old.
And I think about this in the context, we're both chairing Black Studies departments. Mm-hmm. John is the dean of the Annenberg School of Communication. Craig has done amazing stuff in communications. When you got into this, what did you imagine for your career?
It's interesting, Mark, because I never imagined I would be an administrator of anything. But I'm OCD, and I'm anal retentive, and so that makes for a person. It makes for a good leader in terms of getting stuff done. Yeah. And so because I'm so attentive to details, I get asked to do a lot of stuff. It doesn't mean I want to do all that stuff, because the thing with me is I feel too much. So while I'm chairing, I'm on the road, right. Performing, or I'm writing, and because I've been doing administration for 8 years.
Mentoring.
Yeah, and producing graduate students, and also in addition, writing books, editing books, and performing. And while you're young, that's kind of exciting and fun. But once you turn that half-century mark, it's like, oh, Lord. Oh, what I got to do today? And, balls start dropping. You can't hold them all. Right. And so at this point in my career, I'm trying to peel off some of those things so that I can sort of stay in one lane rather than five. But on the other hand, I really enjoyed doing all the work that I've done, because I also think that it's important that we do this work. Yeah. We complain about departments and institutions, but we have to be the change makers.
Absolutely.
So it's important for people like us to be around the table when certain decisions are being made. Yeah. So I'm really proud of the work that I've done in a leadership role, but now I think I've done it. It's time to pass the mantle off and grow some other folks up to do that kind of work. But I don't regret it. Yeah. But it's not what I imagined I would be doing.
What's next for you?
That's a good question. I'm going to be on leave next year, and I'm going to enjoy doing the book tour. Yeah. The film will be done, so we'll be doing the festival tour. And I have another book dropping in October. I'm really excited about it. It's another version of Black Queer Southern Women. It's a creative nonfiction version called Honeypot. And Duke University Press is publishing that. And so I'm going to see where that goes. So, I really enjoy multimodal forms of intellectual work, you know, books, performance, film, creative nonfiction, because I think there's not one form that does the work or appeals to all audiences. You know, people who read a book are not going to go see a film. People would rather see the film than read the book.
Right.
So all those different ways of communicating scholarship is really fun for me and interesting. And you just get to meet some cool people along the way and collaborate. Doing film is really interesting. It's very different from theater. Like, I describe it as being in a tech rehearsal, a theater tech rehearsal, which those are never fun. Because, you know, film is all about consistency. You know, shoot it from this angle, shoot it from that angle. And
say it again.
Say it again, but say it again this way. The glass still has to be filled this way for consistent. So, you know, it's like, whereas in theater, once you're on stage, you just got to deal with what happened because it's live. So that's exciting too.
We've been joined by E. Patrick Johnson, the Carlos Montezuma Professor of African American Studies and Performance Studies at Northwestern University. He's the author of the new book, Black Queer Southern Women, an Oral History, which was just published by UNC Press. Thanks for joining us as always.
It was my pleasure.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.